Part 8. Jonathan walked back over to the bowl and held out his hand. "Okay, next," he stated, smiling triumphantly. "We only needed one," I shrugged. "Oh," he stated, a bit deflated, and I looked around. "Well, we can finish this batch and then make another kind." I walked to the laptop. "Maybe there are some cookies in here that take a lot of eggs," I chuckled. Michael's watch beeped then, and he brought me over a small thermos. I went to open it, but Jonathan took it, checked the readout on it, then nodded and handed it back. I looked down at it and wrinkled my nose, feeling a little awkward drinking in front of him. He turned and started to talk to my guard, and I quickly drank it down. "So, next batch?" he smiled when I handed it back to Michael. We ended up making 4 full batches of cookies. 1 more batch of sugar cookies, and 1 we found with oatmeal cookies. The last 2 were actually double batches of chocolate chip recipes that we found, because each one required 4 eggs. "Wow, this is a lot of cookies," I finally chuckled. Every counter was filled with cooling treats. Night guards had left, and the 2 werewolves were now sat quietly at the table. Jonathan picked up a plate, put some of each kind on it, and took it to them. We watched them closely as they took their first nervous bite. "These are actually really good," he smiled, relieved, and shoved the rest of the cookie in his mouth. I smiled at Jonathan triumphantly, and he smiled back, just as proud of our accomplishment. The shields had long since come down over the windows, and, as we came down from our culinary high, we turned and gave the rest of the kitchen a hard look. The cooking island was buried under a thick paste of flour, eggs, sugar, remains of eggs, and a dozen other items. The sink was filled with mixing bowls, and the floor was coated in a combination of, well, everything. I giggled as I looked at our footprints in the muck. Just then, one of the maids stepped in, and her eyes nearly popped out of her head before she quickly regained her composure. "I'm going to clean this up," I explained quickly. "We are going to clean it up," Jonathan smiled, stepping up next to me to share the blame. But the werewolf maid only smiled. "Not to worry, this place is always so clean, this will give me something to do." Then she looked both of us up and down, shaking her head as she chuckled. "As for you 2, we looked at each other and then down at ourselves. "I think we need to invest in some aprons, like those people in the videos were wearing," he laughed. Then he bent down and took off his expensive shoes. They were covered in a dried paste of flour and eggs. I frowned and bit my lower lip. "Don't you dare look like that," he grinned. "I can't remember the last time I had so much fun." I looked at him and he nodded. "Good, clean, well, okay, not very clean, but real fun." I could see in his eyes that he meant it, and my smile came back. His eyes lingered on me, sparkling with his smile, until I fidgeted and looked towards the door. "Well, I better go clean up." He nodded, still smiling. "Agreed, although we might need spatulas to scrape this stuff off us." We gave the room one more look, then I pulled off my own cake shoes and we left. Even with that thoughtful act, we still left a trail of dust behind us. "Will it be this much fun at Beamer's?" I asked when we stopped outside my bedroom door. "I don't know," he shrugged playfully. "This is pretty hard to beat, but I'll see what I can do." I smiled and went into my room. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I smelled him and smiled. I inhaled slowly and looked towards the closed canopy on my bed. I hurried to my dresser, grabbed my pajamas, and headed to the bathroom. I tried to hurry, afraid he would leave before I was done, but I had to wash my hair 3 times to get all the goo out. I towel-dried my hair the best I could, ran a brush through it, and crammed my dough-muck clothes into the hamper. Then I opened the door slowly and stepped out into the pitch-black room. My eyes adjusted quickly, and I inhaled again and smiled. He was still there. As I walked towards my bed, I watched and listened for any signs of an ambush. When I heard his low, steady breathing, I relaxed and straightened. He was asleep. I crawled into bed and wriggled under the covers. Track mumbled and rolled over, his eyes blinking open. "Where have you been?" he asked in a quiet, sleepy voice. "Making you cookies," I chuckled, and he grinned, his eyes still half closed. He was laying on his back, and I curled up next to him, resting my head on his shoulder. He put his arm around me and kissed the top of my head. "I love your cookies." Then he drifted back off to sleep. I bit my lip. If I told him that Jonathan helped me, he'd get upset. Why did my best friend and a possible new friend have to dislike each other so much? Was it just the male territory thing? Was it the werewolf versus vampire thing? I sighed, nuzzled against him, and closed my eyes. Chapter 6. I felt Track stir under me, and I moaned. "Shh, go back to sleep," he whispered into my hair. I blinked and looked up at him. He smiled at me. "I've got to get back." When I went to sit up, he shook his head, put 2 fingers on my forehead, and pushed me back on the pillow. "You get too grumpy when you don't sleep," he chuckled in a quiet voice, then reached over, grabbed Wolfie, and tucked him into my arms. I took my little stuffed friend, smiled, and rolled over. Track leaned into my ear. "I'll see you tonight." He kissed my cheek, and I nodded slowly, then closed my eyes and fell back to sleep, smiling. Track walked quietly to the door, carefully turning the handle, and slipped out of the room. He gave a nod to the 2 werewolf guards and wiggled his brows when they smiled and shook their heads at him. They knew he basically had full immunity here and only watched him as he headed down the hall. With the manor on heavy lockdown, he couldn't take his usual route out the window, so he turned and trotted lazily down the stairs, humming under his breath. As he headed towards a back door, another door opened to the side, and he turned. Jonathan stepped out, dressed in silk pajama bottoms, his hair messed up with sleep. The vampire looked behind him as he ran a hand through his hair. Track grinned, looking back up the stairs, then turned and shrugged. "She hates sleeping alone," he whispered, then winked and continued down the hall. When I finally woke up, I laid there and inhaled deeply. He may have left, but I could still smell my best friend, on the bed and even on Wolfie, who smelled more like him now. I smiled and sat up, automatically pulling my clock out from under my pillow. 4 o'clock. What was I doing waking up so early again? I sighed and slid out of the thick canopy. I walked into the bathroom and groaned in the mirror. Going to bed with your hair wet and sleeping tangled in the arms of a wolf didn't do anything good for your hair. I opened my cabinet and pulled out a squirt bottle. There was no need for a full shower, but I had to do something with this mess. So I wet it down, toweled it off, and grabbed my blow dryer. Part way through, I stopped and eyed the door, listening. "Hello?" I finally called out. There was no reply, and I turned back to the mirror and finished drying my hair. Finally satisfied, I hung the dryer on its hook, ran the brush through it one more time, and headed back to my room. After pulling a pair of random jeans out of my dresser, I headed to my closet for a shirt. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed all the bags from Allison and Jonathan's shopping spree lined up on the floor. Moaning, I flicked on the light and leaned over to glance into one. Empty? Then I looked up and noticed that someone had actually hung up all the clothes. I groaned at the small section of cashmere sweaters that beamed in colors that made me flinch. There was no way I was wearing those bright, fuzzy things. But one new article caught my eye, and I put my hand out, pushed the other hangers away from it, and inspected it a bit closer. It was a simple dark green top, soft but not too shiny. I pulled it off the hanger and held it in front of me. Short sleeves, neckline was almost square, a bit too low for me but sensible. I chuckled. Did I really just say sensible? Finally I shrugged, pulled it over my head, then flipped my hair out. It was fitted at the waist, but not too tight, and it was actually pretty comfortable. Giving the flurry of sweaters a final huff, I walked back to my room, shoved my feet into a pair of slippers, and headed to the door. Michael and Anders stood from their large chairs. "Good evening, boys," I winked, then turned and headed towards the main hall. First on my agenda was to talk to make sure the maid from this morning got paid well for having to clean up that mess in the kitchen. As I walked down the stairs, I looked around. Something was missing. "Where's Allison?" I asked over my shoulder. "She went into town with her mother," Michael replied. "But it's still light out," I stated in a doubtful tone. "They took a closed car and are going to a vampire-friendly store. She said she wanted to pick up a few more things for tonight." He shrugged afterwards to show he didn't understand any more than I did. I frowned, but continued down. For a girl that was stuck to me like cling wrap when she first got here, she had been invisible since we got back from Polson. Not my problem, I told myself, and then stopped as a door opened. Jonathan and his father stepped out of a room, along with one of the other men I had met earlier. They all bid me good evening, and I responded in kind. Jonathan stepped away from them and up to me. "If you can give me just a few more minutes here." I looked at the other men and then back at him. "Well, I wasn't looking for you," I gestured down the hall. "I was going to see about that maid from this morning." He gazed at me until I finally chuckled. "Never mind, anyhow. Take your time." I saw an odd look cross his face and I peered back. "What?" I whispered, as his dad and the other man pretended not to be listening. "Nothing, it's just—" He shook his head, forcing the smile back. "I'll come find you as soon as I'm done." I stared back at him, trying to figure out the odd expression. He seemed irritated by something about me, but what? Finally, not really caring enough to try harder, I gave a non-committal shrug and headed towards my original destination. Halfway down the hall, a worker opened another large set of doors that created a small breeze. I stopped, suddenly realizing why Jonathan had looked at me the way he did. I lifted my arm and sniffed it. I smelled like track. To him, I probably just smelled like a werewolf, but I sniffed my arm again. I wonder if he could tell. Then I wondered why it should matter. Any vampire could smell werewolf. I tilted my head in thought and then turned. "Can you guys smell the werewolf in me?" I asked, looking up. Ander nodded, and Michael elaborated. "We can, because we've spent so much time with you. I'm not sure the untrained nose could, normally." He ended with a wink. Huh. I chewed the information over, decided against asking them if they could smell track on me, then turned back down the hall. After speaking with the head maid and making sure the one from this morning was properly compensated for the extra work, I walked to another room that had a split door. The top half was opened, and a man quickly appeared, smiled at me, and handed me a thermos. I thanked him, opened it, and tilted it to my mouth. When I finished, I handed him back the bottle and glanced behind him. The small door gave way to a room filled with shelves. On the far side was another door that led to their massive workshop, or secret laboratory, or whatever they called it. He was our scientist/doctor, or at least one of them. Aside from keeping us fed, they worked on things like my protective blanket, and who knows what else. Since that only held the slightest interest, I went to turn. but the man called out to me. When I stepped back up, he held out a chain with an amulet on it. When I took it, he leaned on the small counter. It has a button on each side. He pointed to the oval charm that was silver-colored and looked like a small mirror. You push this one when you eat, then it will track the time, and a warning sound will beep when you need to eat again, he stated, smiling proudly at the device. I wanted to groan. Great. Another announcement of my weakness. Instead, I tried to pretend to be amazed. We both turned at the sound of footsteps approaching. Jonathan walked up, and the scientist excitedly turned to him and gave him the same pitch on his latest invention. Jonathan listened, then took the necklace and turned to me. When I didn't react, he lifted the necklace and his brows. I frowned, but gave a small nod. He attached the magnetic clasp behind my neck, and I sighed as I pulled my hair out. The disc rested just below the hollow of my throat. Even though the buttons were on the side and invisible, I felt like I was wearing a neon sign. Jonathan turned back to the scientist. How about something like this, with a sensor on the back, he stated seriously. That way she doesn't have to remember to push any buttons. Something that can monitor her body and know when she was in need, the man stated, looking way too excited. I rolled my eyes and walked off, leaving the two of them to talk. Jonathan jogged up to me, and I looked away. What's wrong? I don't like feeling like a freak, I mumbled, trying desperately to ignore the metal against my skin. That isn't meant to do that, he stated firmly. I know, I replied in a tight voice, then sighed. Look, it's bad enough being a vampire with a condition, as my dad calls it. He chuckled, and I shot him a hard look. You shouldn't be ashamed of it, he smiled. You get to live in two very different worlds and enjoy them both. And the price I pay is all of these ridiculous rules. Make sure Reina eats. Make sure Reina sleeps. Make sure Reina... I clapped my mouth shut, and he frowned. Is there something else? Not to be overly rude, but it's not really any of your business, I stated quickly. Okay, so that was rude. I bit my lip, reached up, and started to fidget with the monstrous necklace around my neck. Suddenly it started to beep. I stopped and tried to push the buttons, but the low, annoying beeping continued. Crap, I snapped, pulling it out and to try to look down at it. I almost went cross-eyed trying to find the hidden buttons, and the sound started to get louder. Jonathan reached behind my hair, unhooked it, and pulled it off. I'm not sure if that was the cause or not, but as soon as he had it in his hand, the beeping got even louder. Seems they didn't test this well enough. He almost had to yell, and I nodded, putting my hands over my ears. He wrapped his fist around the now blaring object, then pulled one of my hands down. I'll be right back. I lowered my other hand and nodded as he turned and stormed back down the hallway. My brows tightened as I watched him, the horrible wailing now muffled by his closed fist. When I looked back at Michael and Ander, they were both grinning. What? I shot out. Michael shrugged. He seems very protective over you. I already have bodyguards, I huffed, which only made Michael laugh. Ander just winked at me. I shook my head at both of them, turned, and headed down another hall. As soon as I made the turn, I saw a few council members talking to each other. I stiffened and went to turn back, but they had already seen me and waved me over, smiling. I mentally calmed myself down, straightened my face, and gave a polite smile as I walked towards them. I gave Michael a quick look that said, "Save me," and then stepped up. They all said hello, and I was turning to respond to Jonathan's dad when I noticed him look behind me. I turned and watched his son jog up and stop next to me. When I turned back to the small group, his father's smile had widened. He looked at us both and seemed ready to burst with pride. Again, I had to contain myself and ignored that attention. Luckily, one of the other men commented on how amazing the manor was. Another quickly added his own praise over the security measures. Michael did save me then, and offered to arrange a small tour later. Well, seems you have business to take care of, I said, giving Jonathan a fake smile. Why would you say that? He chuckled. I glanced back at the others, and his father shook his head, still smiling. They've just arrived, and I'm filling them in on what the rest of us have already discussed. When the other man nodded, Mr. Hilver did as well. You two kids go enjoy yourselves. My eyes widened, but Jonathan gently took my arm, thanked them all, and then turned me back down the way I had come. You can go back to them, I stated, as the shock wore off. I was just going to go for a swim, and I'm pretty sure Michael and Ander can handle watching me do that. Mind if I join you? My brows rose in surprise. Didn't he ever give up? Finally, I shrugged, and he chuckled. When we reached the indoor pool, I nearly ran to one of the dressing rooms and shut the door behind me. I plopped down on the changing bench and shook my head. He was definitely more determined than the others. And a lot cuter, I thought, then giggled quietly. Finally I stood, grabbed a suit from the rack, and took my time putting it on. When I stepped out, I looked over, and Jonathan smiled. He was wearing a pair of dark blue swim trunks, and I felt my eyes move over his muscles, his muscular chest and arms. He was pale, but then again, he was a vampire, and that's how they all were. My skin was not quite as pale, but still lacked any real color. Then I noticed his swim trunks again, and I frowned. I looked down at myself and realized my one piece was the exact same color. Great, we match, I thought in a grumpy tone. Instead of making any conversation, I walked to the edge of the deep end and dove in. Since my life involved having to be locked away for days at a time, my father had built the manor to try to provide me with as much to do as possible. I did love to swim, though. I surfaced and shoved the hair out of my face, then gasped when Jonathan shot up directly in front of me. He shook his hair and then looked down the full-size pool. Race you to the other end. I grinned and nodded. He actually beat me the first lap. And the second. My competitiveness kicked in, and we finally tied on the third round. You better not be going easy on me, I threatened, as we held on to the side. I wouldn't insult you by even trying, he chuckled. 3 more laps, and I still couldn't beat him. I hadn't been able to tie him again either, although I came close. I had to give him credit. He was a fast, strong swimmer. Finally, my competitive irritation relaxed, and I started to laugh and actually enjoy myself. At one point, I hopped out and got the weighted sticks. He climbed out, and we both stood at the edge as I threw him. There are 12, I stated as I tossed the last one in. Whoever gets the most wins. He nodded, and we both dove in. For once, I had finally beat him, coming up with 8 in my hands. The next time I sat on the edge with my legs in the pool, tossed them in, and timed him to see how long it took him to get all 12. He surfaced next to my legs and dropped the bright-colored sticks on the tile. I looked at the large clock on the wall. Not bad, I stated, and he chuckled and lifted himself out of the water. We were sitting next to each other with our legs in the pool, discussing our next competition, when we heard our names called and turned. Allison bounced over, and I grinned, surprised that I had actually missed her a little. She looked at the pile of weighted sticks and then at us, those blue eyes sparkling. So you didn't get enough shopping done the first time, I teased. My mother wanted to help me pick out a few things. I think she's as excited about tonight as I am. She smiled and then sat down on the dry bench just behind us. I didn't like the way she was smiling at us, so I quickly picked a slightly less painful subject. Thank you for all those clothes. You didn't have to do that. Oh, I had so much fun doing it, Reina. Her blue eyes danced, and I could tell she was being sincere. I still want us to plan a real shopping trip. That mall was okay, but... I wrinkled my nose and she grinned and shook her head. I can't believe you don't like to shop. Never have, I smiled, and then stood. They did the same, and I looked at them both. But seems you two have that in common. Maybe you should take Jonathan on that shopping trip, I chuckled. But Allison wrinkled her nose at me, and Jonathan turned and started to collect the sticks. When are we leaving anyhow? I asked, changing the subject again. About 10, he stated, with his hands full of dripping objects. Have you shown her the outfit you picked out? Allison asked, grinning at me. Not yet. I was saving that for when she was just about to get ready. I looked at them both, and Allison nodded. It's very pretty, Reina. I know you're going to like it. Pretty? I shot him a look, and he pointed a finger at me over the wet sticks. Just remember, you promised to wear whatever I picked out. I bit my lower lip as he fiddled with the weighted sticks in his hand. What exactly had he bought me to wear? The only images I could come up with made me shiver. Do you get cold? Allison asked, her face a bit worried. Seems I shivered physically and not just mentally. Sometimes, but that's not why... Jonathan grinned and Allison eyed me with curiosity. You actually get cold? I sighed. Here we go again. Yes, a bit, only when it is extreme, and it doesn't really bother me. What does it feel like? She asked, her voice and eyes hungry. Vampires weren't affected by external temperature. They could feel it, it just didn't affect them either way, hot or cold. I could sense them, thanks to my blending of genes, but I never got uncomfortable by either extremes. Allison, why don't you put a suit on and join us? Jonathan put in. We're having contests, and Reina could really use the help, was all he got out. I turned too quickly for him to catch, and I shoved him. The sticks flew into the air as he fell back into the water. Allison gasped and then dodged the splash. I laughed. Jonathan surfaced and shook his hair, eyeing me like a hungry tiger. My eyes grew wide, and I took a few steps away from the edge. There are extra suits in the changing room, I added, keeping the water in my peripheral view just in case. I turned as Michael started to talk into a phone that he always carried on his belt. He looked up at me as he spoke into it. Then his eyes moved to Jonathan, who was climbing out of the side ladder. Anders stood, and Michael nodded and put the phone back to his holster. That must be my company, Jonathan replied in a sly but almost chipper voice. Allison bounced, and I frowned as Michael headed towards us. I invited a few friends to come by, he stated, then looked at the clock. I didn't realize what time it was. My brows lifted, and he smiled at me. I thought it would be a good idea to have you meet them. They're coming to Beamer's with us tonight, and this way, you would have some friendly faces ahead of time, he explained. I frowned, but Allison grinned and looked towards one of the doors. When I turned around, Jonathan was walking off in another direction. I hope they're cute and single, Allison giggled, and I looked at her, wondering which of us was the abnormal one. Stupid question, I thought. I didn't like crowds, except the pack. I wasn't boy crazy, didn't like to shop, never went anywhere without 2 mammoth guards attached to me. I nodded to myself. Yep, I was definitely not your average young vampire. I wasn't even your average hybrid. Allison took my nod to mean I was excited about the new arrivals, as excited as she was, and either smiled again or hadn't stopped. I wasn't sure which. Jonathan walked back up at the same time Anders stepped up and placed himself next to me. I watched Michael move towards the door and then sighed as 3 guys and 2 girls walked into the large auditorium-sized room. Allison's eyes narrowed at the sight of the females, and I knew she was sizing them up as competition. I shook my head and hid a smile as she actually moved closer to me. The five stopped near the door as Michael spoke to them. They listened and nodded, responding too quietly for me to hear. I glanced at Jonathan. They were expected, he replied to my unasked questions, and Michael had them all background checked, and they are cleared. There were rarely any real unexpected guests at the manor. The few times it had actually happened, you would have thought we were being bombed. The poor visitors got a quick lesson in manners around jumpy vampires. Finally, Michael stepped to the side and the small group headed our way. The guys were cute, two with dark brown hair, one with blonde, all cut short in that tossed, sexy style that was in these days. The girls were attractive as well. Like I said, it's just how vampires are. One had long blonde hair and soft waves, and the other had short black hair. They all wore casual but expensive clothes. Jonathan moved up in front of me. Anders slid in directly next to me, watching them as if they might strike at any moment. Can we say overkill? He greeted his friends and then turned and introduced us all. The two brunette guys were Lucas and Drake. The blonde was Joel. Tanya and Jessica were the females, and they all smiled and greeted both me and Allison, who had taken a protective stance on the other side of me. I wondered if she was trying to protect me or her friendship with me. Lucas was the first to move towards me. I felt his eyes move over me. I took a step back and felt Anders' hand on my back to keep me from the pool's edge. Jonathan chuckled and walked over, wrapping a large towel around me. I was still a bit shocked at having them here. I didn't have friends outside of the pack. Having Allison here was even new to me. So standing in front of this group made my skin tingle and I wanted to bolt. Thank you for inviting us, the girl named Tanya stated, smiling at me. Sure, I stammered and looked at Jonathan. I'm afraid I didn't have a chance to let Reina know you were coming, he explained. She had my competitive juices going, and I forgot to tell her. And that is where that one is going to end.